Hi, I'm with David Bokovoy, author of the forthcoming book from Koford Books, authoring the Old Testament, Genesis to Deuteronomy. Um, the short version is that the book is basically an introduction to biblical scholarship and, in particular, historical criticism, the documentary hypothesis, but a way of introducing these things to an LDS audience. David, but first of all, thanks for talking to me.
Thank you. Nice to be on.
You come from something of a unique perspective here. On the one hand, you've done a lot of work, devotional work in Mormonism.
Mm-hmm.
You're a former chaplain at Harvard University.
Yes.
You've obviously, spent a lifetime teaching Sunday school, these kinds of things. But at the same time, you have a PhD in Hebrew Bible from Brandeis. So you kind of are trying to reconcile or balance a very devotional approach to the Bible and to Scripture, while at the same time introducing really rigorous, themes from biblical scholarship. So talk about that a little bit. Talk about what motivated you to write the book in the first place.
It is a combination between two different approaches, devotional, as you suggested, and also very academic and historically critically minded, in the sense that we're looking at the text from an historical perspective, not criticizing it, but critically minded, meaning independent from any particular theological lens. This is what is known as mainline biblical scholarship. If a student were to take a class on Bible, like I teach at the University of Utah, he or she would be introduced to this sort of methodology. So it is fundamentally a secular approach, and yet the observations that biblical scholars gain on the development of the Bible certainly have application for those who take a religious approach to the Scripture, as do Latter-day Saints, myself included, as a believing Mormon.
So let me ask you something then. Kind of a two-part question. The first part, give us a really quick kind of micro Reader's Digest version of what the documentary hypothesis is. And then give us an example of what you just described, where taking a kind of historical, critical approach can maybe lead to an insight about the text or about a scriptural book that can be nevertheless spiritually valuable.
Good. So the documentary hypothesis is the term that biblical scholars use for our understanding of how the first 5 books of the Bible developed. It's a combination of independent documentary sources brought together by an editor. For Mormons, there's a perfect analogy in terms of a very good analogy, perhaps not perfect, but still a very good analogy of what scholars believe is happening in terms of the development of the first 5 books with the Book of Mormon itself.
Right, because with the Book of Mormon, you have these it's much more obvious in the Book of Mormon. You have different authors who have sort of inherited different texts and recombined different texts, and then Mormons taking all these different things, redacting them, editing them, changing them up, zipping them together into a single unified text.
Exactly. And that really is the assumption that almost all biblical scholars, in one form or another, there's some debate as to the relationship of the sources to one another. To what extent can each of the sources be identified as an independent original narrative versus a fragment or a supplement? This debate, so the documentary hypothesis as it exists today in scholarship needs to have some sort of flexibility. I have my own very specific views on it that I articulate in the book for the reader. But ultimately, yes, there is a parallel for Mormons, and I draw this out in the book in terms of how the Book of Mormon presents itself. An editor, redactor, bringing together different sources into one particular religious volume.
So, in a nutshell, you've essentially got 4 kind of textual traditions that you encounter in the first 5 books of the Bible. You've got a priestly source. You've got the Yahwist, the J source. You've got the Deuteronomist and the Elohist. Correct?
Yes. Those are the fundamental documentary sources that consensus hold exist within the first 5 books.
And kind of the go-to example on this is the 2 different creation accounts, correct? Where you have one that reflects the kind of the Elohist perspective,
The priestly.
The priestly perspective, and then the other that's clearly the Yahwist.
Mm-hmm.
And there are important differences, not just in terms of the way that creation is told, but the kind of character that God seems to have. And so, talk a little bit about that.
Good. Yes, and so I intentionally began the study by pointing that out to readers. That when we read Genesis chapter 1, creation is presented as a series of events where God speaks, creation comes into existence, he rests on the sixth day. We enter chapter 2, verse 4, the first half of that, and there's a summary statement that reflects the initial verse. These are the generations when God made the heaven and the earth. And then all of a sudden, the account begins again. It's as if creation never occurred. We start all over, and it's not just another version of creation. It's one that's entirely different in terms of its sequence, Brad, as you indicated, and in its theological perception of God. For instance, the sequence in Genesis chapter 1 for creation is that God creates the plants, he creates the animals, he creates the human beings on the same time, same day, day 6. And then it's the exact opposite, pretty much, in Genesis chapter 2, where God creates man first, then he creates plants, then he creates animals, then finally he creates the woman out of the man's rib. So scholars looked at this and said, well, this clearly seems to present two separate versions of creation that have been brought together in the current form.
Plus, there's another divergence in the text, and this is where the traditions get their name, which you actually have these sort of different Hebrew terms denoting God.
Indeed, which it gives evidence as well that we're dealing with two different sources. So Elohim, translated as God in the King James Version of the Bible in Genesis chapter 1, versus Yahweh Elohim, or Lord, all in caps, God in Genesis chapter 2. And the image of God, as I suggested, it's wonderful because in Genesis chapter 1, we have this view where God is kind of distant, just speaks and things come about. And even the Hebrew verb to create is a divine verb, used only with God and no other actor in the Hebrew Bible, whereas the Hebrew verb asa, to make, in Genesis 2, much more human-like.
Right, Yahweh's getting his hands dirty, literally.
Indeed, right? Working with the soil, he's making man come out of that, and very human-like.
And he's really preoccupied with the humans and what they're doing, and there's nothing distant at all about Yahweh. He might be inscrutable at times, but he's definitely right there.
Exactly, and the fun thing, and I think for readers, is to recognize the very different view then on God's perspective on human nature and what he expects of humankind. So Genesis chapter 1, the command, multiply, replenish the earth, go forward and rule in my image, be like me in essence. Versus Genesis chapter 2, God does not want the humans to partake of the fruit that will grant that very knowledge to multiply, replenish the earth. And, moreover, he doesn't want them to become like the gods, which is precisely what the serpent says will happen if you partake of that fruit. So it's two very different views, which scholars recognize therefore represent two different traditions that have come together through the hand of a redactor or editor, much like, again, Mormon is viewed in terms of the Book of Mormon.
So just a follow-up then on the question I asked before. Can you give an example? I'm sure you have many, but can you give an example of where this kind of historical critical reading, this source critical reading, has actually shed insights on the text or shed light on the text that has been sort of spiritually valuable to you? Oh,
good. Yes. So I link it in the book with Doctrine and Covenants, section 1, verse 24, where in reference to the revelations that Joseph receives as part of the Book of Commandments, it states that these commandments, meaning these revelations, were given to my servants in their weakness after the manner of their language, that they might come to an understanding. And from that, I take that the view is that God reveals himself through an individual's culture, through his or her perspectives and language, as is specified in the verse. And so entering the world of the Bible, entering the world of the ancient Near East, we're able to see the diverse ways that individuals in their language, in their culture, have depicted their relationship to divinity.
Like they've encountered God in a different idiom because...
Exactly.
And language is a big part of how these traditions get teased out. They write differently, even in different forms of Hebrew.
And therefore, as a believing Latter-day Saint, I appreciate that because I can go into a text and look at it critically and say, fascinating way that this writer perceives divinity is different than my view. But I can be challenged by that and say, is there something I can take from that that perhaps would enhance my understanding of the way that I connect with thee, even if I don't agree fully, and therefore be challenged by that. And maybe I, in effect, should shift some of my own religious paradigms in accordance with this way that divinity reached out and touched the heart and mind of that particular author.
And we can see this in our own tradition, right? I mean, there's clearly this enormous impact that an encounter with divinity has on Joseph Smith at a young age.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it's also abundantly clear that, in the years leading up to his death, he understood divinity from a very different perspective. It was a much more enriched, in some ways much more radical, but clearly different from what he understood about the nature of God, sort of as a youth.
Exactly. In fact, it's a subtle point, but I do draw attention to this in the book, that we see evolution similar to what I'm trying to depict in terms of the development of biblical sources in Joseph Smith's own first vision accounts.
Yeah. So, final question, was there anything that was either particularly difficult or particularly gratifying in the process of actually writing the book for you?
It's a very personal project. You hinted at this, Brad, at the beginning of the conversation about being religious and entering into the devotional world and being academic at the same time. And the university that I studied with as a graduate student is a non-sectarian Jewish institution. And I was definitely impacted by my Jewish friends, my Jewish professors, in their perspective of asking questions, having debate, having dialogue, having discussion, and even doubts, as all of which added up to a spiritual pursuit from their perspective. I love that about Reform and conservative Judaism, and it's influenced the way that I look at my own life, my own religiosity. And so to be able to articulate and express that in a volume such as this, hopefully to reach out to a Latter-day Saint audience and show, even if a reader does not accept all of the ways that I recreate the evidence, and a Latter-day Saint need not fear to entertain these sorts of ideas, to engage them seriously. And in fact, the prophet Joseph Smith certainly did. He turns to Joshua Seixas, a biblical scholar, and asks for guidance in learning biblical Hebrew. He defines Mormonism as a philosophy that seeks to embrace all truth, let it come from whatever source it may. So if there are truths about the scriptures that we can glean from scholarly insights and research, we'll bring that in and make that a part of our understanding of how the text developed. Right? It was gratifying, definitely, to be able to articulate that and hopefully express in a way that audience can connect with.
Well, I hope we've teased the audience just enough to get them to want to read more. The title is Authoring the Old Testament, available very soon from Kofort Books. You can even pre-order it now at the website. Thanks for talking to me, David.
Thank you so much.
Take care.